Sea Lion had been fighting since the beginning of the war. During the German invasion of Norway, the S-class boats suffered serious losses fighting in the mined narrow passages and shallow waters of Skagerrak. One of the most remarkable men on the Sea Lion was its chief mechanic, Marriott, a tall, grim man, a submariner of the old school, who possessed an unusually well-developed sardonic sense of humour. At sea, he constantly wore a very peculiar headdress of his own invention. It was an oblong piece of cardboard, intricately curved and pressed into an old and dirty helmet that had once been soft blue. As he walked through the control room to the engine room in his unchanged headdress and with a nonchalant expression on his face, which seemed to be inhabited only by his eyes, he might well have been mistaken for an old monk who had stepped out of the pages of Boccaccio, and by misunderstanding had come to us in a submarine. I often visited the mechanics in port to listen to his fascinating stories, and he was an excellent storyteller. I decided to mention him in the pages of this book because many months later, while looking through the engine room log, I found several poems written by his steady hand on oil-stained pages. In particular, he told the world in verse the fate of the S-class boats in the early months of the war, and he did it much better than I can do. 12 small S-boats went to sea one day. The Sea Star went ahead and there were 11 left. The 11 cautious S-boats tried to stick together. The Seahorse didn't answer the call and there were 10 left. The 10 stubborn S-boats went forward, Sterlet sank and there were 9 left. 9 brave S-boats tempted fate. The Shark did not win, leaving 8. 8 stalwart S-boats, with men from Hunt and Devon. The Shark was too late and there were 7. The 7 brave S-boats tested different techniques. Swordfish tried the newest and there were 6 left. 6 tireless S-boats fought for life. Hammerfish suddenly went silent and there were 5 left. 5 shabby S-boats kept watch off the shore. The Rough Rider came too close and there were 4 left. 4 intrepid S-boats went out into the open sea. The Moonfish got hit by bombs and there were 3 of us left. 3 shabby S-boats went out on combat patrol. 2 tired S-boats, a lone S-boat. He left blank spaces to complete his poem later. I am very happy to report that it was not needed. Sea Lion, Sea Wolf, and Sturgeon lived to see the end of the war. This is an example of the peculiar sense of humour this man possessed. He was certainly a fatalist, prone to black humour, but his moods were far from defeatist. On the contrary, he invariably encouraged the crew. Communicating with men who had been in hard fighting and seen a lot of things was extremely useful to me at that time. The officers on the new boat were unfamiliar to me. The chief mate was McVeigh, a very quiet Scotsman, who usually seemed a little timid and shy, but was quick to become assertive, even aggressive, if the situation demanded it. Stroud's navigator was called Vasco by everyone around him. He was an extremely noisy man with a heart of gold and absolutely devoid of tact. Our engineer was Francis, a fat and laughing short man who knew his business like a god. They were all combat officers, but accepted me as an equal and helped me solve my many problems. I must admit that my assignment to the Sea Lion was a great stroke of luck in every way, and first of all because I could not have dreamed of a better commander than Lieutenant Commander Ben Brian. He was one of those commanders who trust his subordinates, do not control their every move, and from the very beginning make you believe in your own strength, gain confidence in yourself. For some reason with him, war always seemed like a game, although he took this game very seriously. He tried to use every minute to improve his skills, to improve the qualifications of officers. Briand was always ready to strike at the enemy, but he did it with such ease and cheerful bravado that most of the time we had the strange feeling that we were playing pirates. He was tall, had the bushy beard of a sea-wolf, and a haughty look. That is to say, he had the typical appearance of an old sailor. He was an unusually well-read man, always telling something, sometimes even composing long ballads, which invariably aroused the interest of others. He had a rare gift to easily transform from a strict commander into a cheerful comrade without losing his dignity. On the evening of September 12th, we left Portsmouth for a 2-week trip to the Bay of Biscay. A minesweeper escorted us to the beginning of the approach channel, after which we parted. Our task was to check the trim, after which we waited until dark. I took the first dive very hard, but when we then surfaced it was even worse. We were walking down the channel in total darkness. Whether I was sitting in the wardroom or lying in my bunk, I dreaded every minute the sound of the engine telegraph, signifying the command "full astern," which was sure to be followed by a collision. I could not shake off the certainty that it was bound to happen. I spent 2 hours of my first watch on the bridge in a state of near panic. It was so dark that I could barely see the horizon through my binoculars. It seemed to me that ships were approaching us from all sides, ready to ram the boat. Somewhere in the middle of the watch I became convinced that I had returned to the submarine fleet for nothing, for I could never be useful here. Fortunately, my second watch was in the early morning, visibility was much improved, and I was able to calm down. Still, when the first rays of the rising sun appeared in the sky and the captain made the decision to dive, I was relieved. I felt safer underwater. I was too worried about the possibility of a repeat of the night collision. On the second day, we reached our assigned position near Lorient. One of our tasks was to rendezvous with a French fishing boat from which we were to transfer secret documents smuggled out of occupied France. We planned to identify the fishing vessel by the following predetermined features. The sails on it were to beat against the mast. In addition, a man was to climb the mast from time to time. On the appointed day, as luck would have it, the wind died down. We approached a small fishing fleet. The small vessels stood almost motionless on the calm mirror surface, on all of them. Without exception, the sails hung lazily and only occasionally swayed a little in the weak wind, but they did not think of beating against the masts. The captain kept his eye on the periscope. It must be said that it is not an easy task to use a periscope in the calm without anyone noticing it, and we had to pass between ships to try and spot the right one. It was only late in the evening that the captain noticed a man climbing the mast on one of the ships. Of course, there may be many reasons why a man should be sent to the mast on any ship, but we could not help taking the opportunity. So when it got dark, we came close to this vessel. During the night we surfaced. The distance to the vessel was very short, within hearing distance. We had with us a young Frenchman who had already made several trips to and from the occupied territory of France. He travelled to the ship in a small canoe to make sure we didn't make the wrong choice. In case there was a mistake after all, our gun crew was on standby. The canoe disappeared into the darkness, and from there we heard some unintelligible speech, after which our Frenchman shouted, "It's all right, it's our own." A dinghy was lowered from the fishing vessel, and in a few minutes we were handed 2 suitcases full of papers and a bottle of wine, a souvenir for the captain. He was not indebted, and as a return gift sent the French captain a bottle of Scotch whisky. While the exchange of courtesies was going on, the observers noticed another vessel without lights, which came suspiciously close to us. We hastily broke off the conversation, fished our Frenchman out of the water with the canoe, and hurried away. Apart from this little adventure and a few false alarms, nothing of interest occurred during this hike. Toward the end of the hike, I managed to get my nerves in relative order, but until the very end of the service I felt uncomfortable at night on the surface. I was never able to get rid of this feeling completely. It always seemed to me that it was safer underwater. At last we returned to Fort Blockhouse, where 2 pieces of news awaited us. First, Ben Brian was leaving the Sea Lion to take command of the Safari, a new and improved S-class boat being completed at Camel Laird's shipyard. His place was to be taken by George Colvin, whom none of us knew. And secondly, the Sea Lion was going to winter above the Arctic Circle in a Russian port near Murmansk. George Colvin commanded the Moonfish, which was damaged by a German bomb while docked, and shortly before that he had brought back from Iceland the first German submarine captured during the war. Our new commander had very white skin and a bright red beard. When smiling, he always wrinkled his nose funny. Over time, we became very attached to this man. The next hike we went on was in late fall and headed for the polar latitudes. Along the way, we made a stop in Danuna to take on board special supplies and Arctic clothing. After that, we stopped for refuelling at Scarpa Flow. That same night we left Scarpa. We had 1,500 miles to go. There was a gusty north wind, which in the open sea became a hurricane. I'd never seen such fierce weather before. All in all, it was a very promising start. I had to get used to the hard work of a submariner in the northern latitudes. At night, roaring wind, furious sea, hastily prepared food and moisture everywhere. From the combat deck house, water got into the control room, and from there found its way to all corners. My clothes were always wet and there was no way to dry them. But for me, the biggest torture was waking up for night watch. 10 o'clock is your watch, sir. By the way, the XO said to tell you it hasn't gotten any drier up there. Someone shakes you by the shoulder, but you refuse to believe in the inevitability of rising and try with all your might to return to the cosy warmth of sleep. But the rude man doesn't lag behind and starts shaking you more insistently, preventing you from finishing your dream about charming blondes. You should be on the bridge in 5 minutes, sir. With a Herculean effort, you raise yourself on your elbow and gaze sleepily into the semi-darkness, desperately envying those who can continue to snore peacefully behind their curtains, and trying to assure yourself that the ship is not tossing about as much as it was 4 hours ago when you went to bed. But the lamp hanging over the table is still waving in all directions, and you realize that nothing has changed and the sea has not tamed its ferocity. Groaning and groaning, you put your feet down on the wobbling deck, listening to how you feel. With all this turbulence, you could vomit at any moment. Cursing, you slip into your Ursulov suit boots and trudge down the gangway to the gangway. As you scramble up the gangway to the war room, another wave hits the boat and you are hit with icy spray, along with those sitting in the control room. You curse and climb out of the hatch onto the bridge and look around. The night is dark, the wind howling deafeningly. Another wave crashes onto the deck, and you cling frantically with both hands to the bridge railing to keep from being swept overboard. As the water recedes, you approach the chief mate 3 minutes late, and he expresses his displeasure. He waits for your eyes to adjust to the darkness, gives you the watch and leaves the bridge without delay. How you envy him. You try to make yourself comfortable to survive the 2 hours with minimum losses, but you realize that nothing good awaits you. You stare intensely into the darkness of the storm, instinctively pulling your head into your shoulders as the boat is hit by another blast of icy water. And you secretly suspect that the sea is aiming specifically at you. Binoculars are useless in this weather. You look around and feel the water squelching in your boots, icy streams running down your neck, penetrating into your gloves and freezing your fingers, making them wooden. You stare out to sea, trying to catch any sign of the approaching calm, but you realize the futility of these attempts. Right in front of you, you can see the bow of the submarine. It's bobbing up to the surface and then burying itself in the water, bouncing and twitching like a wounded whale on its way to the underworld. You grit your teeth, chasing away the remnants of sleep. It's a curious pattern. The closer you get to the end of your watch, the longer the time drags on. If the man who's supposed to take over for you is late, you begin to hate him with a passion you never thought you were capable of. When he finally crawls out of the hatch with a proper apology, you're afraid to open your mouth lest you say too much. But when you step off the bridge and take your first steps down the gangway, all you think about is a warm bunk and 4 hours of blissful sleep. Vasco was always late for watch. The chief mate flatly refused the honour of being replaced by the captain, and the hard part fell to me. So my watch was always 10 to 15 minutes longer. Then we came up with a great idea. Move the starting time of each watch by 10 minutes without informing Vasco. Everything went fine, but now Vasco never stopped complaining that the chief mate was always late for watch. We got into the habit of speaking in garbled German when giving and taking watch, pretending to be 2 prim German officers. The procedure always ended with the phrase, "God save England," and a ridiculous Nazi salute. Sometimes we tried to sing the whole thing, turning the comedy into a distant semblance of a Wagnerian opera. The lookouts probably thought we were insane from the cold. In such weather we had no rest during the day when we went under water. The waves were often so high that even at the periscope depth the boat swung like a mad pendulum. We had to work hard to keep at the right depth. Through the periscope we saw only the frantic dance of the waves, and the horizon, if we could see it, jumped so fast that it was almost impossible to keep track of it. Green waves lapped the periscope, leaving wisps of foam on the lens. Sometimes, in order not to finally exhaust the batteries, we had to go to greater depths, dooming ourselves then to complete blindness. It should be noted that in the open sea the movement of the waves can be felt even at a depth of 80 feet. Resurfacing in a heavy storm is also a tricky business. Before the water has drained from the unsealed parts of the superstructure and the boat has reached full buoyancy, it is very unstable, and if surfaced so that a wave hits the side, there is danger of capsizing when it hits. The first S-class boats were imperfect in this respect, and it is believed that one of them was lost by capsizing. That is why we always took extra care when surfacing. The boat was placed with its nose to the wave. When diving, on the contrary, we put the boat with its side to the wave, so that the lifting force did not hinder the dive. As we approached the Arctic Circle, the wind began to subside, the sky cleared, and we were finally able to determine our location by the celestial luminaries. At night the sky was coloured with multicoloured polar lights, and every day the moon and the sun rose lower and lower above the horizon. We recovered a little after the long storms, dried our clothes, began to eat normal food, and even, if possible, to entertain ourselves. We often played all sorts of games: point, trick-track, chess, cribbage. Personally, I liked poker the most, but the most popular game on our boat was Ludo. We played it every day and even organised competitions. One day the captain, a little embarrassed, took out of his drawer a few balls of coloured thread, a needle, a piece of cloth, and began cross-stitching some complicated pattern on a half-finished pillowcase. He said that he found such a hobby to be a creative activity, a good distraction and calming of the nerves. He would come up with his own designs, and when he started a new job, he always listened carefully to the advice he received from all sides about colour choices. Some of us carved wooden models of the sea lion. The mechanics, who had considerably more options, made their models out of copper. The assistant torpedo officer was making violins. In his spare time he would find a secluded spot somewhere in a nook between the pipes and feel perfectly happy cutting and working wooden planks. He even finished one violin, I think, but more often than not he was dissatisfied with the shape of the individual parts, which he spent long weeks making, and broke them. He was the oldest on our submarine and had one cherished wish: to kill as many Germans as possible. When the alarm sounded, he would freeze at the torpedo tubes with his fingers on the triggers, and was usually disappointed if the alarm turned out to be false. He was a virtuoso accordion player, and often in the evenings the music would play long in the crowded reserve torpedo bay, making the submariners forget the sorrows and hardships of sea service. And the day came when we crossed the polar circle. The days became even shorter and colder. We rounded Norway, passed between Cape Nordkapp and Medveji Island, and then began to descend to Kola Bay, where we were to be met by a Soviet destroyer. We expected to see the coastline on the night before the agreed rendezvous date, but the horizon was deserted and we could see nothing but clouds. One might have doubted the accuracy of our navigational instruments. However, when we dived before dawn, Vasco had no doubt that everything was correct, and as dawn broke, it appeared that the land was quite close. The high cliffs were white with snow and, illuminated by the moonlight, gave the illusion of extraordinary clarity. 15 minutes before the appointed hour, the chief mate reported to the captain that he could see through the periscope a destroyer approaching. The captain waited until there were a few cable meters between us, and surfaced at exactly the appointed time. After exchanging identification signals, we took position astern of the destroyer and proceeded to the entrance to Kola Bay. The sailors were eagerly looking at the snow-white shores opening before them. It was a new, unknown to us land. Soon we approached Polyarny, a small port which was to become our base. Murmansk, the destination of the British convoys which were beginning to come into Russia, was a few miles up the river. Leaving England, we were pretty sure that all the Russians had beards and decided to take advantage of the long crossing to grow our own. As it turned out, all the Russians in Polyani were clean-shaven, and we were the only ones with beards. The representative of the British command who arrived in Polyani was shocked by the increased hairiness of the representatives of the British Royal Navy. However, in Polyani a lot of things horrified the Prim Admiral. He did not even bother to hide from our Soviet allies his disapproval of the existing regime in the country, and was extremely suspicious of any of their proposals. His discontent was multiplied by the fact that his movement around Polani was restricted to certain routes. Once he was even arrested when he entered one of the restricted areas. The Russians also treated us with a fair amount of suspicion. Their guards were hostile and always kept their weapons at the ready. I must admit that walking past them was quite unpleasant. Perhaps their nervousness was justified. We were only 30 miles from Finland and German-occupied Norway. Sometimes at night we saw silent figures dressed in white. These were Red Army soldiers marching to the front, the northernmost front in the history of wars. This front was extremely important because Murmansk was the only ice-free northern Soviet port, and the cargoes delivered here by our convoys were sent by rail to the interior of the Soviet Union. The airmen had already sent a squadron of Spitfires here to ensure air superiority. The purpose of our submarines' arrival was to assist Russian submarines operating in the shipping lanes along the coast of Norway, off the ports of Kirkenes and Petsamo, through which the Germans were supplying their army in the north. Submarine attacks in these areas could divert German attention from the passage of British convoys. Sea Lion was the third British submarine to come to Pola. The first to arrive here was the Tigris under the command of Boggy Bone. This boat made many successful combat trips and returned to England, taking with her as a passenger a live reindeer. The Trident under Sladen's command was still here. The Russian boats had not been very effective before the British appeared in Pola, but afterward the Russian sailors improved their tactics and became much more successful. Everything around us seemed extremely strange. Our breath froze and became vapour. This was the first time we encountered this phenomenon. The air was crystal clear and amazingly transparent. The sea and the sky seemed equally grey-blue against the snowy whiteness. We enjoyed ourselves as boys, walking on the crisp, untouched snow and falling into the fluffy drifts. At first we were surprised, but soon we got used to the fact that skis and sleds pulled by a tired nag are common means of transportation here. The tall red brick buildings looked very imposing from afar, but up close they were peeling from the frost. But the Russians always had central heating and delicious and hearty hot food. Returning from a camping trip, we lived on the shore. A Russian cook and 2 waitresses were assigned to us. They served us excellent vegetable soups. There were always bowls of caviar and plates with thick slices of smoked salmon on the table. From the window of the dining room there was a beautiful view of the bay, and on the wall hung a huge map of Europe, where flags marked the location of submarines. Just below the ceiling, near the point marking Pola, stuck out a lone British flag. The headquarters of the submarine fleet was located in the same building. The senior officer was Commander Davis, and the staff officer was a black-bearded reservist named Bray. Bray had an incredible array of duties, and there was always someone looking for him. We often heard the indignant cry echoing through the droning corridors, "Bray, I." The interpreter was a tired Russian woman named Galina. She had no femininity or sense of humour, but she argued tirelessly about politics and provided us with trite communist propaganda slogans at every opportunity. In retaliation, we often began to joke about the wonderful life in Soviet Russia. This usually ended with her flying out of the room, red with anger, not forgetting to slam the door. In my opinion, she never doubted for a minute that we were all capitalists and imperialists. We were called allies, but we rarely saw our Soviet brothers in arms. Of course, the language barrier also played its part, but the main reason was the lack of mutual trust at the top. The British are not a warlike nation, so they quickly forgot about the wars in which they were involved. But the Russians, it seemed to me, still remembered that we had fought against the Bolsheviks at the beginning of the revolution. As it happened, the most we saw of the Russians was on the evening of our arrival. We were invited to a concert. Together with numerous commanders of the Northern Fleet, we took our seats in the sumptuously decorated hall. It should be noted that we were, without doubt, the object of everyone's curiosity. Tired to death after a long and difficult transition, we sincerely hoped that the concert would not last long, and were extremely annoyed when it turned out that before the concert there would be a political rally. The solemn speeches lasted for an hour. Their content remained a mystery to us. We could only catch that all the speakers periodically mentioned Stalin's name. Each time there was a long applause, and the orchestra played one verse of the Internationale. All this was repeated at least 15 times in an hour. At last the concert began. It consisted of a wide variety of acts, the performers being sailors from the ships in the harbour. I doubt if there would have been so much talent in the Royal Navy. The sailors danced well, and when they started singing traditional sea songs, I knew exactly what the phrase "blood runs cold in my veins" meant. Afterward, the assistant torpedo officer from our sea line appeared on stage. We never found out how he got on the programme. He performed several songs from his accordion repertoire with feeling and finished his performance with the romance Black Eyes, which was accompanied by long applause. Then all the audience sang Internationale in friendship, and the concert ended. We went out into the snow again. One evening we invited the officers of a Russian submarine standing next to the Sea Lion to visit us. It was agreed that an interpreter would come with them, but at the last moment it turned out that he was busy with something else. Given that the guests and hosts had no way of understanding each other, the evening promised to be very peculiar. The Russians came in, shook hands with us, and seated themselves in the wardroom. We put gin, whiskey, brandy, rum, and sherry on the table, and made signs for them to choose. They all decided on whiskey and drank their portions quickly, neatly, and most importantly, all at the same time. Then they decided to try the sherry. We tried not to show our surprise, satisfied the guest's request, and got down to the whiskey. It turned out that one of the guests spoke a little German. Remembering that I had also learned it at school, we began to talk in the language of our common enemy. I must say, alcohol proved to be an excellent translator. By the time our guests got to the gin, the conversation was already very lively. We brought out a geographical atlas and began to show them our hometowns. They said that it was unlikely that they would be able to visit other countries, since foreign travel was not encouraged by the Soviet leadership. Unfortunately, this very successful experience of Allied communication was not repeated. Leaving England, we assumed that we would be sailing between icebergs and pack ice. But in this section of the Arctic Ocean, the water is ice-free, warmed by the warm Gulf Stream. During patrols between Kola Bay and Cape Nordkap, we never met floating ice floes, but often encountered another unpleasant phenomenon. On a clear weather day, visibility was significantly reduced, if not lost altogether, due to freezing of ice crust on the periscope lenses. If it was snowing, it was impossible to see anything around. During long night vigils on the surface, the water dust, freezing, covered our faces with ice crust, dressed the deck gun and periscope turrets in ice shells, and at the same time the intercom system on the bridge. Large icicles were hanging from the net cable, sometimes so large that the captain was seriously concerned about our stability. In these conditions there was a possibility of freezing of the main air valves, which in case of emergency would have prevented us from making an emergency dive. Therefore, they had to be checked frequently during the night. Water dust covered the edges of the combat deckhouse hatch with a thin film of ice, so they had to be wiped every 15 minutes. One morning, when my watch was over and we were starting another dive, I suddenly found that I could not close the hatch tightly because of the ice. The boat was already sinking, and in a moment the water was going to flood the bridge. I shouted down to Colvin that I could not close the hatch. His round, red-bearded face appeared in the frame of the lower hatch. "Hang on to it," he advised calmly. "Your weight will probably make it close." And I did hang on the hatch, terribly angry at the captain, who did not realize the danger of the moment. No less than half of the Arctic Ocean poured through the gap onto my head. How not to remember another case when I was also in the combat deckhouse and water was falling on my head? But apparently Colvin knew what he was talking about. The water had melted the ice and the pressure on the hatch had increased considerably, and by the time we reached periscope depth, I was able to close it. Speechless with cold and anger, I slid down and went to change my clothes. It was only when I calmed down a bit that I was able to appreciate the funny side of the situation. Patrolling in Arctic waters was proving to be rather boring and monotonous. There were almost no targets, perhaps due to the successful actions of Tigris and Trident, or because of the weather. I remembered 2 episodes. One morning near Nordkapp we spotted a small vessel. Its displacement was not more than 1,000 tons. We gave a warning shot in front of the bow, but it did not stop. Only after the second shot, which hit the engine room, the ship stopped and a dinghy was lowered from it. It turned out that our victim was a Norwegian vessel. It wasn't too lucky, but the Norwegians were carrying German cargo under compulsion, and this flow had to be stopped. I was sent to the foredeck to give the Norwegians the help they needed, while Colvin continued to shoot the ship from the deck gun, a 3-inch gun mounted at an angle of only 5 degrees to the horizontal plane. The deck gun is a loud-voiced machine, and when the shells whistle overhead, the sensations are not pleasant. When the first shell flew over me, I jumped up in surprise, turned toward the bridge and waved my arms in protest. But Colvin only grinned into his beard and went on with his work. He was still firing when we spotted a German airplane flying along the shoreline. It was no more than 4 miles away from us. The moment was very unpleasant as we still had Norwegian sailors on deck, one of whom was badly wounded. Fortunately, the German did not notice us. Eventually our shells made enough holes in the Norwegian ship's hull that it went down. We safely loaded the prisoners aboard and retired to periscope depth. We all took a great liking to the Norwegian captain, who was friendly, simple, and pleasant to talk to. A short time later, the Norwegians were sent to England, and a month later, Colvin's mother faced an extraordinary situation. In a letter, she wrote that she was completely confused when a stranger came to her and said that he was the captain of the ship that had sunk her son. After a little hesitation, she invited him in and very soon discovered that he was a charming young man who had no intention of taking revenge on her. Colvin was more sensitive than most naval officers I have known, and never treated his victims with the indifference that would be natural to a man whose profession was war. It is not to say that he did not understand the necessity for the destruction and loss of life that was inevitable in the process of war. But it always seemed to me that when a torpedo sent by him hit its target, he always vividly pictured the shattered steel, torn flesh, streams of water, gasping lungs. I remember an incident on another campaign when we attacked a merchant ship bound for Kirkenes. He looked through the periscope for a long time, and then quickly turned away and exclaimed, "God knows how much I hate this job." He had seen the torpedo make an impressive hole in the side of the ship under the captain's bridge, and he did not want to look any further. The ship we hit had no escort ships and no danger to us, so anyone who wanted to could look through the periscope. That was the first time I saw a ship sink. It went under slowly, settling on its bow. People were running around the tilted deck in panic. We breathed a sigh of relief when we noticed that they had launched a dinghy. The dinghy had gotten far enough away before the boat's bow dug sharply into the water and spiraled to the bottom. We saw that the boat was steadily heading towards land visible nearby, so there was no need for us to discover ourselves. Colvin was not at all pleased with this success. We were overjoyed when orders came to us to return home just before Christmas. The Trident was long gone, replaced by the Seawolf. It is impossible not to admit that we were already tired of the newness around us. We missed home, warmth, and companionship. The endless Arctic night, The monotonous landscape and the tiresome snow had made our souls despondent, and the unfriendliness and suspicion of our allies, for the sake of helping them we had travelled so many miles, did not help to raise our spirits either. The elation of returning home was slightly dampened by the order to raid the Lofoten Islands on the way back. On Christmas Day we were still in Polar and looked longingly at the snow-covered mountain tops, but we soon put to sea and made the passage to the Shetland Islands. At Lerwick we arrived very tired and almost without fuel. The very next day we went on. Very soon the Irish Sea was behind us, and we found ourselves in our native Portsmouth, and the boat took its place at Fort Blockhouse. Great changes awaited us after our return from leave. McVeigh and Vasco were given new appointments. I was terribly proud when I learned that Colvin had nominated me for chief mate. Lieutenant Ivan Reike took my place as torpedo officer, and Lieutenant Mike Willoughby was appointed navigator instead of Vasco. The senior mate is responsible to the captain for keeping the ship running. He organises watches, assigns duties to sailors, trains them, monitors the health of the crew. In other words, he is responsible for everything that directly or indirectly affects the efficient operation of the ship. On submarines, the chief mate has another duty, on the proper performance of which in the full sense of the word depends the life and death of the ship: trim. All watch officers on a submarine can adjust trim if necessary during a watch, but the initial trim is the responsibility of the chief mate. At the beginning of each cruise, the weight of the submarine changes compared to its weight during the previous dive. This is due to the loading of torpedoes, ammunition, food, fresh water, and sometimes passengers. The chief mate must compensate for all changes by adjusting the amount of water in the trim tanks. He must know not only the numerical value of the additional weight, but also how it is distributed along the length of the submarine. All this requires quite complex mathematical calculations, and if a serious error is made in them, the submarine can easily go to the bottom on the first dive. During the training we were shown and told how to trim, but I had never been good at math, so when I became a senior mate and was faced with the need to do complex and cumbersome calculations on a regular basis, I immediately began to think of ways to simplify the problem. All the calculations were identical. The moment is the weight multiplied by the distance to the centre of the ship. Very quickly I discovered that an ordinary logarithmic ruler was ideal for performing them. I carefully plotted all the available tanks on the boat on my ruler and began to calculate trim in just a few minutes, and with a much lower probability of error. I didn't have to wait long for the opportunity to put my knowledge into practice. A few days after returning from leave, we were ordered to prepare for an urgent departure to the Bay of Biscay. There were rumours that German warships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which had stood in Brest for almost a year, would break through to the German port. We were to be part of a large flotilla of submarines patrolling Brest. Ever since air reconnaissance first detected enemy ships in Brest last March, our submarines had been constantly in the area. They even began to be called the Iron Ring, though greatly exaggerating their merits. In order to form a truly impassable barrier required a very large number of submarines, which were not available. In addition, the submarines constantly had new work. This became especially noticeable after the entry of Italy into the war, the defeat of France, and the need for the presence of our submarine fleet in the Mediterranean. In addition, we must not forget that during the Norwegian campaign our submarine fleet suffered considerable losses. Nevertheless, all submarines that could be released went to the Bay of Biscay. There they often spent time unproductively. If they saw other people's ships, it was an errant German submarine or a random ship that decided at its own risk to break the blockade ring. Now, although the Sea Lion was in need of repair and re-equipment, it was hastily sent to reinforce the Iron Ring. We had no idea where the German cruisers will go, through the English Channel, or will break into the Atlantic to bypass Scotland and enter one of the Norwegian ports. On the night of February 6th, we reached our assigned point a few miles west of Wesson. Nothing happened for the next 48 hours, but on February 8 we received a radiogram that brought us much excitement. The main German force is expected to conduct sea trials before going to the open sea. Immediately proceed to the point with coordinates 48°05' north latitude, 5°11' west longitude. If the currents allow, enter the Gulf of Iroise and conduct reconnaissance. If possible, attack. How not to get excited? Such a thing. However, having properly studied the map, we realized that the task before us is not easy, if not to say impossible. There are probably patrolling anti-submarine ships, there are anti-submarine barriers and minefields, but in addition, the strong currents between the rocks and reefs of the Chaussée de Seine are a big problem for a submarine floating underwater. As we surfaced at night and slowly sailed along the French coast, recharging our batteries, another problem was vividly discussed in the wardroom. At that period of the war, the submarine fleet was woefully short of torpedoes. With the outbreak of war in the Mediterranean, their consumption has increased manifold, and mass production of new torpedoes Mark VN has not yet been established. On the Sea Lion was 12 torpedoes, 6 in the apparatus and 6 in the reserve torpedo compartment. When we loaded at Fort Blockhouse before going to sea, there were only 6 Mark the T torpedoes available, and the other 6 we received as hybrids. They had the body from the Mark Twain but the warhead from the Mark IV, which was slightly longer than the Mark Twain's. Unfortunately, we had no information on how these hybrid torpedoes behaved. No one had even tested them, but since they were too long to fit on the racks, we had to load them into the torpedo tubes and leave the normal Mark V torpedoes for reloading. Even in the open sea, where there is enough space for any manoeuvres, it was dangerous to use unknown torpedoes. And in our case, the situation was the opposite. We had to operate in a limited space in the presence of enemy destroyers, when any failure in the torpedo apparatus will give away our position and with a high probability will lead to the death of the boat. Moreover, we had a new and untrained chief mate who had no experience in controlling the boat at the moment of salvo, even if the torpedoes are quite normal, and we had a new torpedo officer and his assistant. Based on the above, Colvin considered the situation unfavourable and decided that it was foolish to attack such important targets using questionable torpedoes. But how long would it take to remove them from the vehicles and replace them with ordinary Mark VIII torpedoes? Because of their excessive length, the combined torpedoes will not fit on the racks, so the warheads will have to be removed before they are stowed. I should note that the process of removing even a normal torpedo from the tube, if the rack is occupied, is not easy, let alone ours. On top of all this, the question arose, where to store warheads from the Mark IV. The problems are many, but nothing was impossible in the above operations. Analysing the situation, we concluded that the work can be done in 18 hours. However, reloading torpedo tubes at sea is done only when the boat is underwater, where it is less exposed to external influences. Consequently, it will take us 2 nights to complete the work, and the attack is scheduled for tomorrow. And Colvin has made an unprecedented decision. Then we shoot these things into the ocean. Schiff Francis took a deep puff and let out a cloud of smoke that stretched upward and enveloped the lamp swinging above our heads. We sat in silence and watched the smoke billow in the air, vibrating from the running diesels. If only these infestations weren't so expensive, sighed the captain, pulled the hood of his Ursulov suit over his head, and went to the bridge. Be that as it may, the decision had been made, and it had to be implemented without wasting time. Before dawn we loaded, conducted a training attack, and fired all the torpedoes presumably toward America. We couldn't follow their movements because it was too dark. One thing was very important. The Sea Lion jumped to the surface during the salvo. Although it was a costly exercise, I had gained invaluable experience. Now I knew exactly how to keep the boat at depth when firing. Loading torpedoes, Mark Wabe in the vacated tubes, was not a difficult task, and early in the day we were again ready to fire a salvo, if necessary. It was the morning of February 9th. In the afternoon we found a signal buoy, which marked the seaward end of the Chaussée de Seine, a navigationally dangerous section of the seabed. consisting entirely of rocks and shoals. It is shaped like a tongue extending into the ocean 15 miles from the mainland. This ridge of rocks runs along the south side of the waiter space Kalediru-Az, a wide bay where the German cruisers were expected to conduct sea trials. We had orders to penetrate this bay as far as possible in daylight. To prevent the boat from being thrown onto the rocks, we were to enter the bay with the tide and leave before the end of low tide. We could do nothing until the next morning, and so another problem arose: where to go at night to recharge our batteries. It seemed obvious that the enemy's ships would appear in the northwest part of the bay if they took the channel, or in the southwest part, where we were now, if they chose a roundabout route. "As the Irish say," muttered the captain, conjuring up a map, "I'm not a bird and can't be in two places at once." He supposed that the Admiralty had reason to expect a breakthrough on the southwest quarter, so we were directed to take that position and decided to remain within sight of the signal buoy. "The night was dark, the sea calm," Colvin wrote in his report. "We observed increased activity on the water and in the air. Lights were seen to the north of the signal buoy. Judging by their number, there are at least 2 patrol ships there." When we first entered Iroise, the morning was quiet and clear. We spent several hours under the glassy surface of the water and did not see a single ship. That said, the visibility was excellent. If there had been even one ship in Iroise, I would have spotted it, Colvin wrote. With the onset of low tide, we set a course to leave the bay. At night, we were not disturbed. Once nearby flew Dornier, but did not notice us. The next day, February 11th, we once again surveyed Iroise, and again with no results. After dark, the boat once again surfaced. Around midnight, when I was getting ready to turn in my watch, an airplane came out of the darkness. It glided through the air almost silently and, flying over our heads, dropped a flare, which in a few seconds flooded the bridge with blinding white light. We hurriedly dived, expecting that the depth bombs were about to burst, but nothing happened. Half an hour later, we surfaced again, and nothing significant happened until morning. We returned to Fort Blockhouse on the morning of February 15th, and Colvin immediately went to report to Admiral Dark to report everything that had happened, including the lost torpedoes. 2 hours later, he appeared in the wardroom, not at all cheerful. "You know, number one," he sighed, "I think I've been hit. The Admiral is angry to the extreme and is out for my blood. He is now waiting for a reply from our headquarters in London." As we were having coffee after lunch, a sailor came for Colvin. The commander had been gone nearly 2 hours, and we began to fear the worst. But when Colvin returned, he had a satisfied smile on his face. The reply from London was that Lieutenant Commander Colvin's actions could not be regarded as routine, but under the peculiar circumstances they could be considered justified. Sea Lion was in dire need of repairs, before which we had one more trip, this time to the coast of Norway. On February 26th, we sailed into the Irish Sea. It was surprisingly warm, almost like summer. Mike Willoughby and I stood for hours on the bridge and carried on conversations. Mike was an unattractive but surprisingly charming guy, and his life was full of events. Mike's childhood had been rough, and at the age of 15 he joined the Navy, where he spent 4 years. After that he worked as a skipper on a yacht, a dock labourer, a vacuum cleaner salesman, a second mate on a sailboat, a clerk to a shady businessman who ended his career at the Old Bailey, a painter, a chauffeur, and an advertising manager for firms making concrete blocks, steam tools, and motorboats. In the summer of 1939, he made the Atlantic crossing on the yacht Windward with a crew of ex-International Brigade fighters fleeing Spain. In the fall of 1939, he became second mate on a tanker, then commanded the yacht during the evacuation from Dunkirk, then worked for a time as a navigator. In November 1941, he was trained for submarine navigation. Sea Lion was his second submarine. We arrived at Holy Loch early in the morning and moored at the ship Forward, a floating base of the 3rd Submarine Flotilla. Here we spent a few days, prepared for the campaign, and went to sea again. The campaign was very unsuccessful. I remembered only one amusing circumstance. Colvin introduced the practice of making morning dives without a howler signal with only watchmen. There was no need to disturb the entire crew. After a hard watch on the bridge is so nice to wake up in a warm bed and find that the submarine has long been underwater and everything is done without you. It also gave the young officers a chance to learn how to do the first trim of the ship. One morning, Ivan Riki began to perform the dive at such an angle that Mike, who was sleeping peacefully on a bunk set perpendicular to the diametric plane of the ship, flew out of his seat and collapsed to the deck with a thud. The next morning, the dive was performed by Mike. He decided to get revenge and took a big angler too, only he overlooked the fact that this time I was sleeping on the perpendicular bunk. So the next morning, I increased the angle even more, and Ivan fell to the deck. And to make the retaliation complete, the horizontal rudder operators had overdone it a little in correcting the angle of dive, and had pushed the bow of the boat up so sharply that the navigation instruments and books on the laying table fell on the unfortunate man. After this incident, Colvin ordered us to choose another method of amusement. We did not see a single enemy ship on the way, and in this we were very lucky, for by that time we had too much trouble piling up. I've kept some notes from those days. 15:03:42. Everything went wrong on this trip from the very beginning. The overboard muffler flooded. On the first day, a leak started through the exhaust system into the port side engine and bilge space. This meant that water had to be pumped out continuously to prevent the motors from flooding. There was a strong swell during the night, and we were constantly being hit by waves. Eventually, the water completed the job, and the left electric motor failed. We could not repair it at sea. On another dive, someone inadvertently left valve A open, and we took 400 gallons of outside water into the forward compartments, causing us to sink to a depth of 270 feet before we were able to stop the process. After we had dealt with this problem, the commander forgot to close valve A before opening valve W. Water flowed from A to W, and it became impossible to control the bubble. And yesterday, as we were going with a strong trim on the bow, we discovered that some debris had gotten into the AIV valve the day before, and the tank was now flooded. In addition, as a result of the short circuit, we had problems with navigation lights. Radio station was malfunctioning, seals broke and there was water in the periscope shaft, and many other unpleasant little things. 16:03:42, again a misfortune. The main bearing of the starboard electric motor overheated and flew. If to take into account that the engine of the port side was already switched off, the situation became really serious. 17:03:42. The bearing was replaced in time to go underwater at dawn, but recharging was now impossible. When we surface at night, we will have to go without recharging for 36 hours. The boat was in such a technical condition that it was pointless and very dangerous to stay on alert at sea, so we requested permission to return to base. Having received it, we with great difficulty reached to Holly Loch, and we were brought before a board of inquiry who wanted an answer to the question of how we could have been so grossly negligent as to cause the flooding of the left motor. As chief mate, I received a fair amount of displeasure from their lordships, but the Sea Lion was still sent for repairs. Colvin left us and took command of the Tigris. A few days later, I received an appointment as chief mate on the new boat Saracen, which was being completed at Camel Laird's shipyard. The Sea Lion was a very sad sight, and I left it with a heavy heart. I did not know then that we were yet to meet. It is with great regret that I must report that George Colvin died a year later in the Mediterranean. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his exploits. It was not until I arrived at Camel Laird's dockyard that I learned that my new commanding officer would be Lieutenant M. Lambie, whom I had met many times at Fort Blockhouse. Lambie was a tall, wiry young man, very determined and confident. He was an excellent squash and cricket player, and had no doubt that he had come into this world for great things. I can't say that I was very happy to be appointed to him as a senior assistant. It was a bit scary. I had to plunge head first into the daily life of a giant shipyard. From morning till night the clatter of riveting hammers was heard in the empty metal rooms, as if thousands of woodpeckers were hard at work in the forest of steel. Lifting cranes groaned and rattled, blinding welding fires crackled, metal, wood and paint smelled. I got acquainted with the craftsmen and workers employed on our submarine. The sturdy hull was complete, and now it was to be filled with all kinds of machinery, instruments and equipment, furniture and utensils, everything that might be needed. Warrant Engineer M. Stevenson arrived at the shipyard before any of us and had been working here for several months. He was responsible for the operation of the propulsion system and all of the ship's devices and systems. I had to know how everything worked to be able to maximize the ship's effectiveness in combat. Besides, the rest of the crew had already started to arrive. I had to get to know everyone and immediately start building a cohesive team. Submarine construction in wartime is an ongoing friendly but stubborn rivalry between officers and shipyard management. Every submarine commander, unless of course he is a young greenhorn, has his own ideas on how to make the submarine an effective fighting machine and create acceptable conditions for human life in it. The exact arrangement of intercoms on the bridge, telephones in each compartment, water level indicators in the tanks, torpedo exit alarms, lights, electric radiators, fans, arrangement of bunks, galley plan, shape of the laying table. All these details were carefully watched by Lambie and myself. In the first place, we did not consider them trifles, and in the second place, we thought it right to insist on our own, for we were to live and fight in this boat. The shipyard management sympathized with us and tried to meet our demands, but they also had to reckon with the requirements of standardization in order not to slow down the construction. As the chief mate, I tried to be tactful but persistent in every possible way to get our demands met. Sometimes it was enough to have a few words with the contractor, sometimes it was enough to have a chat with the foreman and insistently demand something from the manager. If the problem was not solved, another way was to persuade the captain to pay a visit to the Admiralty representative whose job it was to supervise the construction. Each of us had our own devices, which were very tempting to make in the factory. Lambie had developed a special logarithmic ruler for calculating torpedo firing intervals and deflections, and I was anxious to get an improved version of my differit ruler. I must say that the shipyard management tried to meet our needs and always helped us if possible. With each passing day, the submarine acquired more and more resemblance to a warship, the crew arrived and dock trials began. The last to report to Camel Laird's were two officers. One of them, assigned as torpedo and gunnery officer, I already knew. This was young Ivan Rakes of the Sea Lion. The navigator was Tony Johnson, a tall, handsome Irishman who had been a student of agriculture before the war. He always took with him to see some slices, which in his free time from watch he enthusiastically looked through a microscope. And the day came when all the construction work was completed. The submarine was stripped of the wires and cables that entangled her, severing the last thread connecting her to the shore. We took on board supplies and escorted to Dunoon to join the 3rd Flotilla and conduct sea trials and exercises, after which we were to go to the Mediterranean. For 2 months we trained hard, trying to anticipate possible emergencies and learning how to deal with them. Then we went out on a trial trip, the purpose of which was to give the crew a chance to get used to the sailing conditions and the captain to gain experience of going to a given point and returning back. We were sent to a relatively quiet area where an encounter with the enemy was unlikely. However, on this mostly training cruise, Lambie managed to distinguish himself by sinking a German submarine and bringing home a German prisoner. We were in the central part of the North Sea, which for many days remained completely deserted. Everywhere, as far as the eye could see, there was only the grey surface of the sea. When the day before the end of the campaign, who was on watch? Tony Johnson saw in the periscope rising out of the water angular deckhouse of a German submarine. He did not immediately believe his eyes, but the enemy ship was quite real, with the water bubbling and foaming around it. "Captain to the control room," he shouted enthusiastically. "Alert! An enemy submarine is surfacing." Everyone rushed to their seats. Lambie began to call out, "Bearing and distances," even before Rakes turned on his fruit machine. The conditions for the attack were difficult. It was already dark, and the boat would hardly stick to one direction and speed after surfacing to make it easy for us. Standing behind the backs of the horizontal rudder operators, I tried to cope with the trim disturbance caused by moving people around the boat. Everyone rushed aft to the control room. So, water should be taken into the bow tanks and pumped out of the mid-tanks. In addition, I was obliged to keep an eye on the helmsmen to ensure that they performed all the necessary actions in time. The boat must be kept at periscope depth at all times, without going below so that the captain could see the battlefield, and at the same time it could not be allowed that because of someone else's mistake the boat would find itself popping up to the surface. If all this was accomplished, the captain could concentrate fully on the attack. 2 minutes later, he gave the order to begin the attack. "Ready all 6 tubes," and then, "First one goes, second, third." I hardly heard anything further because I was busy pumping water into the bow tanks and increasing my speed so as not to be on the surface. Calmly, as if we were still on drill, Acoustician Crosby reported, "All torpedoes out, sir." Soon there was a deafening explosion. We got the enemy. Lambie took a long, careful look at the horizon through his periscope, then ordered us to surface. As soon as we were fully buoyant and started the engines, I asked permission to go up to the bridge. As I opened the hatch, I took a deep breath of fresh sea air and saw a few stars shining merrily in the dark night sky. I suspect that it was because of the stars that the German captain surfaced. He needed to determine the location of the ship. Meanwhile, our captain was leading the boat to the place of explosion. We could already see several objects floating in the water. In a few minutes we approached the place of the catastrophe. Numerous debris was floating around us. There was a sharp smell of oil spilling over the water. In the middle of the oil slick we noticed 3 people. One of them was actively floundering in the water, but as we approached he raised his arms up and went under. Another was dead. He was lying on the water with his back up, arms and legs spread out ridiculously, and did not move. The third gave signs of life, and we pulled him up on deck. He was unconscious and moaning loudly, spewing streams of seawater and oil from his stomach. The sailors dragged him to the bridge. There he regained consciousness for a while, opened his eyes and looked at me. His eyes blazed with despair and hatred. Both feelings were so strong that I confess I felt uneasy. Then he lost consciousness again. The sailors carefully lowered him into the interior. We were to dive again to reload the torpedo tubes. That night we surfaced later than usual to recharge the batteries. Having a prisoner on a submarine makes it very difficult. There is nowhere to lock him up, and we must not forget that a man familiar with the construction of a submarine can quite easily do irreparable damage to it if he is willing to sacrifice his own life. So he should be kept under 24-hour armed guard, that is, distracting people from their daily duties. Even in the latrine he could get at some valvus if he wanted to, which meant that he could not be overlooked when performing natural human needs. We fitted our prisoner for cleaning, and he did not shirk his work. As we learned, he was a forward lookout and was on the bridge with the navigator and captain when they were hit by our torpedo. After the explosion he remembered almost nothing. We only managed to establish that after the explosion the second torpedo hit the engine room, but did not explode. We returned to Danun victorious, but we did not have to rejoice for long, because we immediately began preparations for the passage to the Mediterranean. People got a 4-day vacation, which flew by unnoticed. At the end of August, we again went to sea and took a course to Gibraltar. It was just as Browning had described it, majestic and grey, lost in the haze of the northeast. It was the first time I had ever been to these parts, and I was overwhelmed with new impressions. 2 nights in a row we inhaled the spicy smells coming from the coast of Portugal, then observed Cape São Vicente through a periscope, and at night we passed the Gulf of Cadiz. We did not see it, but somehow felt it. When we reached the rendezvous point with the boat that was to take us through the narrow strait, we had the opportunity to admire the Spanish coast on one side and the African coast on the other. I thought that in these places the immortal spirit of Admiral Nelson must be flying over the water. We soon retrieved Aldis's signal lamp and began transmitting identification signals to the shore station on the European side. The superstructures of warships in Mediterranean pearl grey garb began to loom up near the shore. Open awnings were visible everywhere. We even caught a glimpse of the hull of the Maidstone, the base ship of the 8th Submarine Flotilla. The day that began promised to be warm and sunny. Lambie first appeared on the bridge in his tropical uniform. White cap, white open shirt with gold epaulettes, white shorts. His socks and shoes were white too. He was looking through binoculars at the city ahead, and I looked at him and was desperately jealous. This brave captain was on his way to the Mediterranean, commanding his own submarine, with an enemy submarine to his credit. When we were a mile from shore, the escort ship left us. A very tanned lieutenant, who had arrived in a motorboat, came up on the bridge to work as our pilot. We passed through a passage in the barrier, turned right, past the South Breakwater and the battleship Malaya standing there, and then moored alongside the Maidstone. There were also 3 other submarines, painted dark blue to make them less visible in the clear and transparent waters of the Mediterranean. Bertie Peacey came to greet us. He was now the commander of the 8th Submarine Flotilla, and looked very imposing. It was a joy to look from the bridge at the towering hulk of the Maidstone above us, and to recognise familiar faces among the greeters who clung to the railing of the shelter deck. Only now, on reaching our destination, did we suddenly feel the heat, as if someone had opened an oven door before us. High above the harbour and the clutter of townhouses, a mountain peak jutted into the sky, with residential buildings and military fortifications on its slopes. It was my first Mediterranean port. I was endlessly happy and excited. Gibraltar, despite the limited space, proved to be a very pleasant place for us. Every kind of sport was at our disposal: tennis, squash, soccer, hockey, sailing. The best entertainment proved to be a walk through the fabulous tunnel, followed by a swim in Catalan Bay. The town of Gibraltar was built in a pseudo-Eastern style. In the neighbourhood of stores, where incredibly expensive luxury goods were sold, there were stores where the shelves were literally bursting with English goods, which at home could be bought only by card or from under the counter. Cars could hardly squeeze through the noisy streets. Sound signals were forbidden here, so any issues that arose in traffic were usually resolved with desperate gesticulation and swearing. Traffic jams occurred often and for long periods of time. During the day, we wore shorts and open shirts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on vacation. At night, we, who had just arrived from England, were delighted by the lack of blackout. As the whole coast around the bay was ablaze with lights, there was no point in darkening the ships, though I think they had been prepared for it. But for the time being, it was possible to keep the hatches and windows open at night and breathe the fresh night air. There were plenty of places to eat and drink in the city. All the officers were honorary members of the local yacht club. Bristol's always offered a good cocktail. Victoria's offered Spanish cuisine. And across the street at the capital you could also dance. It was here that our navigator Tony Johnson, an extremely enthusiastic nature, climbed on a table one night and danced an Irish jig, encouraging himself with wild shouts. The orchestra was delighted. From then on, as soon as Tony appeared in the doorway, the orchestra stopped playing its regular programme and switched to Irish tunes. One time we went to the theatre to see a famous ballerina performing Spanish national dances with castanets. I cannot help but note that at this time there were several units of the Navy Women's Auxiliary in Gibraltar. During these days, I met a senior officer from another submarine, Stephen Spring Rice. Everyone called him Spice. He was one of those men whom they say God loves, and he died a few months after we met when his boat, the R-45, sank with the entire crew. It happened shortly before the order came for him to return home, where he was to take a training course and become the commander of a new submarine. But then, in September 1942, we were not given to foresee the future. We were very preoccupied with the question of whether former reservists would be accepted for commanders' courses, whether we would have a chance to take command of a boat. I was older than Sprice and had been on submarines longer than he had. It was obvious that if seniority in submarine service counted, I would get into the command course before he did. The possibility of someday being in command of my own boat was the least of my worries, but I realized that I would have to work hard for it, and the luck factor would have to play its part. Sprice loved life in all its manifestations and infected others with his inexhaustible enthusiasm. He came from a family of intelligent, educated people and had extremely versatile interests. I think he loved music more than anything else in the world and could play the clarinet for hours, forgetting everything, which he mastered masterfully. I shall never forget one evening on the Maidstone. Spruce's boat had just returned from a trip. I honestly don't remember what we celebrated that day, but we had a lot of fun. First we drank and fooled around in the wardroom, and then we all went to Spice's place, taking with us musical instruments which, together with his famous clarinet, should have made a good orchestra. In the middle of our impromptu concert, Bertie Pease appeared at the door and icily told us that the captain had summoned us all urgently. We were to take our musical, or, as Bertie put it, torture instruments with us. Tucking our tails, we dragged ourselves to the captain's cabin, where we were met by the formidable Barney Fawkes, dressed in his pyjamas. "Do you think," he roared, "I can sleep in this environment? It's a hell of a thing. If you're going to have a concert at night, for God's sake, do it here and we'll have a party." We were so shocked we didn't immediately realize if he was joking or serious. Turns out he wasn't. Drinks appeared on the table and the party went on for 2 hours, with Barney Fawkes and Bertie Pease making as much noise as anyone else. The evening was a success. Time flew fast in Gibraltar. We spent a few days loading supplies and painting the boat dark blue, after which the Saracen made her first trip along the Spanish coast to Barcelona. Here it was impossible to meet enemy ships, but there were many merchant ships of neutral countries around, on which we carried out training attacks to adapt to the Mediterranean conditions. Nothing much happened on the campaign, and we returned to Gibraltar ready for battle. Half the crew were given leave of absence. The lower ranks went to a rest camp for submariners outside the city. Stevenson and I spent 3 days as white men in a rest home for officers, which was adapted part of the hospital for military sailors. I still remember the wonderful view of the harbour from the window of my room. Back on the Saracen, we were ordered to join the 10th Submarine Flotilla based in Malta. Between June 1940, when Mussolini entered the war, and September 1943, when his fleet surrendered, our submarines, stationed in Malta and Alexandria, and later in Beirut and Algiers, sent to the bottom enemy ships with a combined tonnage of more than 1,300,000 tons. During this time, we lost 41 submarines. My purpose is not to describe in detail the actions of our submarines in the Mediterranean. I will only say that when the Saracen left Gibraltar for Malta, the fighting was in full swing. The island had just gone through some of the harshest moments of its history. At the very beginning of the year, the Germans had shown concern about the fate of their maritime supplies to Africa for Rommel and had stepped up air activity. Air raids on Malta became so frequent and massive that it was decided not to use the island as a base for the surface fleet from March to September. Admiral Cunningham had to withdraw his cruisers and destroyers in Alexandria, leaving in Malta only submarines and aircraft to attack ships carrying cargo to Rommel. This period was very intense in the war in the Mediterranean, not to mention the courage with which the population of Malta endured the bombing, which caused many casualties and turned entire neighbourhoods of La Valletta in ruins. The crews of the submarines worked without rest. Returning from one tour, they went straight into another. If there was an opportunity to take a short break between trips to sea, still could not rest. Even in the harbour, boats spent most of the day underwater to protect themselves from the incessant bombs falling on their heads. Attempts to conduct to the island convoys with necessary supplies for some time remained unsuccessful. Malta's food supplies were running low. there began to be a shortage of fuel and ammunition, which had to be delivered at any cost, so that the Spitfires defending the island continued to take off. This task could only be accomplished in one way. The 5 largest submarines of the first flotilla, based in Alexandria, Cachalot, Parthian, Dolphin, Regent, and Rorqual, were adapted for this purpose and delivered vital supplies to the island since mid-1941. The fuel tanks, freshwater tanks, and even the main ballast tanks were filled with fuel. Everything possible was stripped from the boats. Every inch of available space was taken up with ammunition. The process of transporting cargo between Alexandria and Malta was a highly explosive and fire-prone affair, especially when the Italians began laying mines everywhere. But this did not stop the submariners. Only for 1 month, to Malta delivered more than 84,000 gallons of gasoline, 83,000 gallons of kerosene, 12 tons of mail, 30 tons of miscellaneous supplies, 6 tons of ammunition, and about 100 passengers. During the first half of 1942, our submarines sank 54 merchant ships, 2 cruisers, 8 submarines, and an enemy destroyer. Meanwhile, in Malta was properly established air defence, and surface ships were able to return to the island. In September 1942, Rear Admiral A. Power was able to recreate in La Valletta squadron of cruisers and 2 destroyer flotillas. Fuel and food were now delivered by 2 fast minesweepers, Manxmen and Welshmen, whose high speed allowed to overcome the most dangerous parts of the route under cover of darkness. But supplies were still insufficient, so all submarines going to Malta were obliged to be loaded to the brim. In this case, the issue of inconvenience was not considered. We tried only to avoid reducing the combat effectiveness of the submarine. In the last days before the departure, we were busy trying to load Saracen as much as possible, looking for the most unexpected places for supplies. 1 freshwater tank and 2 inner trim tanks were emptied of their contents, opened and filled with canned goods. Boxes of engine parts, torpedo detonators, canned goods, and ammunition were everywhere. In addition to all this, we were to deliver a special cargo to Malta, a human torpedo. It was an ordinary torpedo with a detachable warhead, adapted for transportation by 2 men riding on top of it in diving suits. It must have been prepared for use against targets on Italian naval bases. The transportation of the special cargo was done in secrecy. Silent engineers from the Maidstone appeared on the Saracen and set up a bulky steel container on deck. The night before we sailed, a mysterious torpedo was loaded into it. As we approached Malta, we covered the structure with a tarpaulin that read, "Beware of gasoline." The Saracen had a lot of extra cargo on board, and I was worried about differential. My trusty ruler could no longer cope with this problem, and all my attempts to make more complicated calculations failed. So I decided to take the path of least resistance. When the boat was fully loaded, I looked from the quay to see how she was sitting in the water, and then ordered water to be pumped out until I thought she was sitting level with the waterline. Just in case, I pumped out some more water and arranged with the captain that after leaving the harbour we would dive for trim. We approached Malta in the dark, watching the bombardment of the island from afar. The lines of tracer fire, flares and flashes accompanying the bombing brought us to the island faster than all the navigational signs. We knew that there were many minefields here, so we did not take any risks and calmly waited until dawn, when 2 minesweepers came up and led us through the channel cleared for navigation to the east coast. We had not even had time to enter the harbour when an air raid warning came over the radio. As instructed, we dived to periscope depth and waited for the rebound. As we entered the main harbour, we immediately had the opportunity to see what serious destruction La Valletta had suffered during 2 years of constant air raids. But despite the fact that half of the city's buildings have turned into ruins, the besieged island has preserved its ancient grandeur. Massive walls of medieval fortresses, flat roofs, among which can be seen domes and turrets, white, pink or yellow against the bright blue sky. The base of the submarine fleet was not in the main harbour, but a little east of it in Mar Sumasceto Creek. To our left was Fort St. Elmo, and to our right was the town of Slima. We walked along the river with our flag flying proudly in the wind, clearly attracting the attention of the locals. We were enthusiastically greeted by a group of Maltese children standing at the foot of the wall of some ancient fortress. I can't help but admit that such a welcome was very pleasing to us. After a few minutes, we turned to the right and entered the arm where the submarines were located. Each was moored at a floating wharf. There was no mother ship here, so all the workshops, warehouses and living quarters were located in shore buildings. We were greeted by old comrades and strangers. We took the place indicated to us, then went ashore and went to the wardroom, an imposing room located on the first floor of a stately building that stood nearby. The Malta submarine base was a very peculiar place in those days. The lack of food kept us from forgetting that we were under siege. But compared to the civilian population of the island, we were fed very decently. The enemy air bases in Sicily were only 60 miles away. The constant bombing had already caused considerable damage, and our repair shops continued to operate only through the marvels of ingenuity displayed by their manager, Engineer Sam McGregor. By the time we arrived on the island, the air defences had been greatly improved, but still the air alarms could be heard several times a day. As advance notice, the usual monastery bell was usually sounded, signifying the need to activate the smoke screen. In addition to the smoke bombs placed along the shore, suitable devices were available on the deck of each submarine. In a few minutes, the river branch, where the submarines were stationed, and the shore structures were covered with a thick white fog, and all the inhabitants had long afterward long watery eyes and stinging noses. Sometimes the wind would tear out wisps of fog, and through the resulting gap we could see the air battle over our heads. But there were positives in having the enemy so close. We didn't have to go far to find a suitable target for us either. In those days, no submarine returned to base without striking the enemy. In the first 6 months of that year, the Maltese flotilla, led by Shrimp Simpson, sank 54 merchant ships and 13 warships. Unfortunately, about a month before our arrival, the Maltese flotilla suffered a severe loss. Lieutenant Commander M. Wanklin had not returned from his last campaign, after which he was to have gone home. Commanding the boat Defender, he sent to the bottom about 100,000 tons of enemy merchant tonnage, 3 German submarines and a destroyer. He was awarded the Order of Meritorious Service, and for his actions in Malta he was awarded Britain's highest award, the Victoria Cross, which he was the first submariner to receive in World War II. I did not have the opportunity to meet Wanklin, but many of my new acquaintances were people quite famous. Suffice it to mention Fatty Linton from the Turbulent, Dick Calais from the Ultimate, and the other commanders had a lot of merit. The world of submariners is a small one. There was Ben Bryan on the Safari. His chief mate was now a Canadian, Freddie Sherwood, whom I replaced on the Sea Lion. In the Maltese flotilla, Lambie met officers with whom he had studied at the commander's course, McJoch, Stevens, Crawford, Bromage. Very soon, Spruce on the R-45 joined us as well. There were a lot of targets, torpedoes were spent quickly, and the trips were short. A submarine could return to harbour with empty tubes a week after leaving. In the early days we had no luck. I remember patrolling in the shallow waters of Gabes Bay, where the African coast turns steeply northward from the Libyan deserts to Tunisia. Here we seemed to have sunk a small commercial vessel, but had no way of verifying it. On another occasion we stayed a whole week in the neighbourhood of Naples, being able to look through the periscope all day at Vesuvius and the island of Capri, but did not encounter a single enemy vessel. In the middle of October, we returned to Malta to prepare, and in 4 or 5 days to go to sea again. But something unusual was happening. The boats, returning from sea, were performing all the usual operations at the base, receiving torpedoes, ammunition, food, and were not ordered to put to sea. It became clear that we were being held back for some important and large-scale operation. The commanders, who probably had more information, were very reticent, obviously afraid of blabbing. Even the senior aides knew nothing. As the number of waiting boats increased, so did the tension. People were left to make the most unbelievable guesses. There were a lot of rumours floating around the base, one more incredible than the other. We almost constantly lived under the cover of a smokescreen so that spy planes from Sicily did not know how many submarines accumulated at the base. One morning Mike Elambier told me in confidence that we were going out in the evening, but he didn't know exactly where we were going. We had been ready for a long time. All that was left was to load fresh food and personal belongings. At night we went out to sea and took a course to the northwest. During the night, all submarines had to leave the base. 2 days later we reached the point of our combat duty at Cape San Vito, on the northwestern tip of Sicily. That night, while we were on the surface recharging our batteries, reports began to come in of the 8th Army's successful offensive at El Alamein. The news did not seem to surprise the captain, from which we concluded that this particular event had been kept a great secret. Lambie smiled, but would not discuss the matter, and we suspected that something else was expected, especially as it was not quite clear what good we could do for the 8th Army being 1,000 miles away from the scene. A few days later we spotted an Italian submarine heading west. After a brief attack, during which Lambie saw the smiling faces of the Italian officers on the bridge, we blew the enemy ship to pieces with 3 torpedoes. There were no survivors on that submarine. A few days later we were ordered to move to another position, in the Gulf of Tunis. At the same time we were warned that there from the north are approaching 2 supply ships accompanied by 2 destroyers. They are going to the port of Tunis, the main port through which the supply of the enemy army in North Africa. We knew that the convoy must pass the positions of our other submarines as well. I was the watch officer that morning when the convoy was expected to march. I was taking a long and careful look through my periscope at the deserted sea and the sky above our heads, when suddenly the horizon exploded silently, and I saw a bright column of flame. I had just time to shout, "Captain to post!" when the sound of the explosion reached us. We conjectured that MacJoch, whose position was to the north of us, had attacked the enemy. Our guess grew into certainty when the masts and hulls of ships began to appear over the horizon. We saw 2 destroyers and only 1 merchant ship. An hour later they approached us. The captain fired 4 torpedoes, after which we immediately dived deeper to avoid the destroyer's attack. After a long wait there was an explosion, but it might have been the sound of a depth bomb bursting. When we came up to periscope depth, the captain saw that the merchant ship, letting out puffs of black smoke from her chimney, was rapidly heading for the harbour entrance, but she was escorted by only 1 destroyer. Of course, we were annoyed that we had missed our main target, but we settled for little. The surviving destroyer was still walking around the bay for a long time, looking for us. That same night we reported to the base that we missed the merchant ship but sunk the destroyer, and received the answer. "Not bad. Next time, consider that you were aiming at a destroyer." Only now we had an opportunity to satisfy our curiosity, having received news of the Allied landings in Algiers, Oran and Casablanca. Operation Torch was launched. The task of the submarine fleet was to attack Italian warships on their way from bases to landing sites. However, the Italian Navy preferred to wait out the critical time at home bases. We soon saw the reaction of the Germans to what had happened. Blue tropical sky became black from flying U-52, transporting troops from Sicily to Tunisia. At first, noticing the planes, we obediently dived as instructed. But these planes were not interested in submarines, so we stopped bothering and, remaining at periscope depth, watched the progress of transportation. Sometimes 6-engine air giants appeared in the sky with gliders in tow. They would land and immediately take off again, to return in 2 hours with another batch of men. This went on for the rest of our campaign. At the first opportunity, the captain sent a radiogram to Malta, hoping for the intervention of our planes. A few days later, we received orders to return to base. The first night on the return trip, we almost came across 2 Italian submarines patrolling on the surface. We had to expend considerable effort to evade this unwelcome encounter. 2 hours later, standing on the bridge, I was much more frightened by the appearance of another enemy. Visibility had been poor all night, but now the sky was even blacker. In the thickening darkness, I could barely make out the foaming bow of our boat. Menace seemed to hang in the air. Occasionally, a malicious snake of lightning slipped through the blue-black blanket that had descended over us, and having completed its journey, sank into the sea. As I watched the approaching storm, I found myself wondering what would happen to a submarine if lightning struck it. If it can kill you when you're hiding under an oak tree, why can't it do the same when you're standing on a steel hulk with water surrounding you on all sides? When another lightning bolt struck the water 50 yards away, and I heard it hiss before it went out, we were hit with heavy hailstones. In a state of near panic, I called the captain and explained that we were in the middle of a thunderstorm. Visibility was close to 0. We needed to wait out the storm in deep water. The captain agreed, and we went to life-saving depths. Even when the boat reached 80 feet, acousticians could hear the heavy hailstones hitting the water. It took me a few weeks to get over what had happened. Was I really such a coward that I chose to save myself in deep water from an ordinary storm? But no one gave me an answer to the question of what happens to a boat if it is struck by lightning. Returning to Malta, we learned that we would spend the next 10 days ashore, then go out on a short cruise, after which we would sail to the Maidstone, which was preparing to move to the newly taken port of Algiers, 500 miles closer to the submarine area. The widespread belief that the mothership delivers fuel, ammunition, and food to her submarines at sea is a misconception. It would be wrong to expose a floating city with repair and storage facilities and a very skilled technical staff to constant danger. A floating base should be able to quickly shut down all work and move to wherever the strategic need for it is greatest at a given time, taking a few days to do so. Of course, in doing so, it is exposed to the danger of enemy attack, but it is an inevitable risk. Incidentally, in June of that year, the Medway sank after a torpedo attack on the crossing from Alexandria to Beirut. In early December, we said goodbye to Malta, and shortly before Christmas, returning to Algiers on a foggy moonlit night, we found ourselves 2 miles from another submarine, which was also heading west. Examining our unexpected companion through binoculars, we realized that the Italian submarine was nearby. Suddenly it beeped something incomprehensible. Lambie decided to mislead the enemy. He called on the bridge signalman and ordered to semaphore the answer, a meaningless set of symbols. The Italian was probably quite puzzled, but was afraid to appear incompetent and began transmitting again. We responded with the Italian name we had just made up, and the signals stopped. "Call him again," Lambie ordered. "What should I tell him, sir?" "Anything you can think of?" "Yes, sir." As I listened to the click of the trigger, I realized that he was transmitting, one by one, a selection of swear words. Not everyone in wartime gets to say what you think of the enemy to his face. This sailor decided not to miss a unique opportunity. The situation began to resemble a specially staged comedy. Everyone on the bridge made a desperate effort not to laugh. The Italian started signalling something incomprehensible again, and we noticed that he was changing course, intending to come towards us. "Everybody down!" Lambie commanded. "Let's attack!" We rolled down, and in a minute we were submerged. The captain began to look for the enemy through the periscope. But when passing through the many lenses of the periscope, light is partially scattered and lost, so he was able to detect the silhouette of the enemy boat only after a few minutes. The Italian submarine was going slowly. Apparently its captain was perplexed as to where we had disappeared to. But before we went to the attack position, the captain lost sight of the enemy and was unable to detect him again. I guess our failed victim awakened the instinct of self-preservation, and the boat hid in the depths. It's a pity.